How do you daven mincha on an airplane? That's question number one. You just want to daven in general. If you're flying to Israel, you have usually more than one. You have more than one tefillah you have to worry about, because you have mincha, you have mariv, and you have to have shachris the next morning. So there are many people who are very makpid to daven with a minyan. Very makpid. I know people like that. They'll go to any length to daven with a minyan. Should they try to gather a minyan up in the plane and daven someplace in the plane in a minyan? So mincha is 5 minutes, maybe mariv is 10 minutes, but shachris could be half an hour or longer. Where do they daven? How do they daven, and so on? So I think in the past, people know that you're on a plane to Israel. Somebody will come around and say, how many people here want to daven? And when the light, when you're sort of halfway there, the light comes in through the windows. They'll say, okay, they'll wake everybody up, bring you over. You'll start the minyan. Is that a good thing to do? Is that a bad thing to do? So that's davening with the minyan. And the third question you have to ask is, what about people who say kaddish? So people who say kaddish need a minyan. It's a very emotional thing, kaddish. The question is, how strong a chiyuv is kaddish, and to what extent does the feeling of responsibility to say kaddish overcome other obstacles to daven with the minyan? So I'm going to try and deal with those issues, and to see if on an airplane this can be overcome, or how it should be overcome, and so on. So I have like about 8 chapters or something. The first question is it important to daven with the minyan? So that's a bit of a silly question in one sense, because if you ask the rabbi, he'll tell you it's very important for everybody to come to minyan every day if they can possibly do it. What is the benefit of davening with the minyan? So that might be important when we consider alternatives. The first source I brought was from the Shulchan Aruch Harab, which was Rav Shier Miliadi. He was the first Lubavitcher Rebbe. He was the Baal Tanya. I can never remember his exact name. I should, because he was a very, very illustrious person. Yeah, his name was Shneir Zalman ben Rav Baruch, from the town of Liadi. He was born in 1745, and he wrote something called the Shulchan Aruch Harab. For those of you who don't know, we have a Shulchan Aruch that was written in the 16th century, or late 15th century. The Shulchan Aruch Harab was a similar or parallel Shulchan Aruch that was written by the first Lubavitcher Rebbe to, I think, introduce the idea of halacha as seen by maybe the Lubavitch community. It's a very authoritative book. This Rabbi Shneir Zalman ben Rabbi Baruch was a genius in every way. He wrote a philosophical work called the Tanya, which you've all heard about. But here he's very specific in halacha, and he says that the purpose, if you read the first source, the purpose of having a minyan is to sanctify God's name in public. Where does he get that from? So I think he's talking about, there's a Gemara in Brachot, I think it's Mem Zayin, I would call it, in which the Gemara tells a story about Rabbi Eliezer. Rabbi Eliezer was a Tana, and he traveled to a certain town. When he got to that town, he found there were only 9 Jews for a minyan, including himself. But he had a servant, and that servant was what at that time was called an Eved Kanani. Without getting into the details, if the master of an Eved Kanani, of a Canaanite slave, frees that servant, that slave, he automatically becomes Jewish. So Rabbi Eliezer freed the slave, so he could be the 10th person in the minyan to make a minyan. The problem being that there's an Isser in the Torah to free your slave. It's done under certain circumstances, but really if a person at that time owned a Canaanite slave, he was forbidden from the Torah to free him. So what was the justification of Rabbi Eliezer to do that? So the Gemara discusses it, because here you have they discuss what it means to daven by minyan. Davening by minyan is not an obligation from the Torah. It's more of a rabbinic obligation. So how can a rabbinic obligation of davening with a minyan overcome the Torah prohibition of freeing your slave? So they say mitzvah d'Rabbim shani. A mitzvah done for many people is different. What do you mean many people? So the way he seems to explain it, I think, he's saying, what do you mean mitzvah d'Rabbim? He says davening in a minyan is a mitzvah d'Rabbim. It's a mitzvah for many people because it sanctifies God's name among many people in public. The purpose of davening for a minyan that Gemara is telling us is to sanctify God's name in public. There's a part 2 to the first source, which is the usual reason or the justification or rationale for davening with the minyan, the Gemara brings psukim, a pasuk, to show that when the community davens for something, God responds more readily, shall we say, than to a single person davening. So that's the utilitarian part of it, the part that we do it for ourselves. But part number one is brought by the Shulchan Aruch Harav, is the part where we do it for God to sanctify God's name in public. What's important about this? You better be sure that your davening is sanctifying God's name in public. In other words, if you're going to put together a minyan, and it's going to be a chilul Hashem, or it's going to be something which people will look in a negative way upon Jews who are doing something that they feel is inconsiderate, it may not be so important to daven by minyan. That's part one. So I try to come to shul every morning, so I believe in davening with the minyan, but there has to be a sanctification of God's name. That's, I think, is not only true on an airplane. It's any place we as Jews get together to pray. We have to make sure that we have some understanding of the people around us, that they will not look at us in a negative way, but in a positive way. There's God's people, and look how they behave. Okay? Okay, so it is important to daven with the minyan, but it's done for certain reasons. What is the halakhic status of saying Kaddish for lo aleinu, a dead relative? That is very often a justification for getting a minyan together on an airplane, right? You want to say Kaddish. I was speaking to a member recently, he just came back from Israel. People go to Israel to bury lo aleinu, a relative, and they're coming back on the plane. They want to have a minyan. So, what is the status of the obligation for, let's say, a son, let's say, to say Kaddish for a parent? So if you look at the in source 2, subsection 1, the Birchei Yosef, who was also an 18th century rabbi, his name was Rav Yosef David, Azulai. Sorry, excuse me, Rav Chaim Yosef David Azulai. He was 18th century. He was born in Yerushalayim, I think in 1724 it says, and he was a prolific writer, and he wrote a commentary on the Shulchan Aruch, and he's discussing in source 1 what is the basis of Kaddish. So he says he's not even sure. I'm just paraphrasing the source. I'm not reading it. He's not even sure if saying Kaddish is really a mitzvah, a rabbinic mitzvah. It may only be a minhag. Now, not that a minhag is not important, but there is a hierarchy of strength of mitzvahs. There's a mitzvah from the Torah, there's a rabbinic mitzvah. Minhag is a little bit lower in terms of force. And he says, Afki Yesodotov B'Harei Kodesh, the source of it is from the highest sources, from the mountains of holiness, but it's not he says, not a mitzvah from even a rabbinic mitzvah. So again, when you're doing something that's not that has a lower level of command, you may want to consider what you're doing to accomplish it. All right. I also brought in here the second part is from the Abia Omer, which is of course Rav Ovadia Yosef Sefer Tzadik Livracha, who was born where? Where was Rav Ovadia Yosef born?
He was born in Iraq.
Yeah, where? And he was born in Baghdad, by the way.
Yeah.
He was actually he was ordained, I think, as the chief rabbi of Cairo. In 1946, 47, 48, and then he quickly came back to Israel in 1950, I presume, because the Jewish community was expelled there. And he, of course, became the chief Sephardic rabbi of Israel. So in his responsive sefer, he says that from Svara, from his way of looking at things logically, he says that it's possible that the whole mitzvah of saying Kaddish is to show respect for your parents. It's a mitzvah, the same mitzvah as kibbud av v'em. There's some arguments about whether honoring your parents after their death has the same status as honoring someone's parents while they're alive. But that may be rabbinic. There's an argument. But there's one important point here. If the mitzvah of saying Kaddish is the mitzvah to show honor to your parents, what do you mean to show honor to your parents? Someone sees you getting up and saying Kaddish, and they're saying, what a fine gentleman. He comes 2-3 times a day to the synagogue just because of the respect he has for his parents. His parents must have been wonderful people to raise a son that's so dedicated to their spiritual redemption. If the person is saying Kaddish and the people around are saying, who is that creep who's disturbing my sleep, who's giving me problems, it takes away from the respect for the parents. The parents are, in fact, receiving respect through the manifestation of the son saying Kaddish in a very, very positive religious way. So again, saying Kaddish is not it's not like a formula. According to this approach, saying Kaddish has to be done in a way that brings honor to your parents. Right? Okay. So let's tell the category 3. So we've discussed a little bit about the motivations for minyan, for saying Kaddish. What are the exemptions for davening with the minyan? Not everybody comes to shul in the morning to daven for a minyan. And the Shulchan Aruch, the source I brought, says something that many commentators parse and agree and disagree with. It says, "Yishtadel adam hitpalel b'Beit Knesset im hatzibur." A person should try to daven with the with the community in the Beit Knesset. What do you mean he should try? It doesn't say it's a mitzvah. He should try. So most people interpret it to mean it's still a very, very strong religious mitzvah. It's a rabbinic mitzvah, but it does give a sort of a condition. Im hu anus, if he's a person who's forced by circumstances beyond his control that he can't go to minyan in the morning, then he should try at least to daven at the same time that the community is davening. So he can't go, let's say a person is ill, he can't go to minyan, but he knows the minyan at 7:30 starts davening shachar. So he should try to daven the same time as the community minyan in the shul. In our shul, there's so many minyanim, you can daven for 3 hours, right? And the same thing he says goes, are people who lived in communities far away from the main cities, they didn't have a minyan there. They should also try to do the same thing. They should try to daven at the same time contemporaneously or something of that sort with the people in the surrounding areas that are davening. Now, what is circumstances beyond one's control? That's the thing. If you're exempt for circumstances beyond one's control, what is that? So there's a story in the Gemara. I think it's in Daf. Again, in Brachos Daf Yud BAYT. I don't know if I'm with BAYT. I'm not sure exactly where, but I've seen it. Where there was a certain Tana, or there was a certain rabbi, Rav Nachman, I think it was a Mora, who didn't go to minyan one morning, and one of his students came up to him and said, "Rebbe, why didn't you come to minyan this morning?" And he answered him, "I wasn't feeling well." So the question is, why did the student ask the rabbi why he didn't come to minyan? He should assume that if the rabbi didn't come to minyan, he must be very sick. And why does the rabbi say, "I wasn't feeling well"? So the Magen Avraham, who was Rav Avram Gambiner from the 17th century, who is a commentator in the Shulchan Aruch, a very authoritative, very, very influential commentator on the Shulchan Aruch, says that when the Shulchan Aruch says a person does not have to go to minyan if he's forced by circumstances beyond his control, it does not have to be extreme circumstances. Even if he's a little weak, even if he's not seriously ill, because he says in that Gemara, the student would never have asked Rav Nachman why he didn't come to minyan if he was seriously ill. So Rav Nachman was saying, "I'm not seriously ill, I'm just a little bit weak." So, and many people quote the Magen Avraham on this, that a person is allowed to miss minyan if he's not feeling well, but it does not have to be ICU type of illness, right? Okay. And so he says, and he explains that. Also, if you turn the page, the Aruch HaShulchan gives another reason why why a person might be exempt from going to minyan in the morning. The Aruch HaShulchan was, I think, Rav Yechiel Mechel Epstein. Rav Yechiel Mechel Epstein, 19th century. He wrote a Shulchan Aruch. It's called the Aruch HaShulchan, but it's a Shulchan Aruch type of book where he, which was used until I think the Mishnah Berurah as maybe the main indicator of what the halacha was. And he asks, and he tells you right away, a person should not get up early in the morning, before dawn, before the time of davening, so that he can go out and travel somewhere if he's going to miss minyan. So let's say I want to go on a trip. So I book, I want to leave by car. I'm going to leave at 5 o'clock in the morning. It's impossible for me to daven at 5 o'clock in the morning with the minyan. So I daven, and on the way I stop and I daven alone. He says a person should delay his trip, leave later, so that he can daven with the minyan, and then take his trip, because he'll miss davening with the minyan. But he says, so why, he says, do we see people all the time doing the opposite. He says in our town there are people all the time getting up at the dawn, before dawn, going out to travel, and they daven on their own. He says because they're exempt. Why are they exempt? Because these people are going out to make a living. And making a living to support your wife and your family is a mitzvah. That's what he says. One can miss minyan for a mitzvah. So you can miss minyan because of the mitzvah of supporting your family. You can wake up earlier. Why do I bring this? Because this suggests that if a person is a person can miss minyan for a mitzvah, to do a mitzvah. A person could also miss minyan not to do an avera, right? In other words, if what you're doing is a prohibition, is a sin, maybe you shouldn't be davening with the minyan. So the question is, what might be the negative things about davening on an airplane and davening in a minyan with an airplane? So this is based on an article that I read by, I think his name was Rabbi Jason Weiner, who wrote this a number of years ago. I think he's now in Los Angeles. He's involved in medical halacha with one of the medical institutions there. That was very, very well written. And he tries to bring a number of reasons why there might be something very negative about having a minyan on an airplane. First of all, when you have a minyan on an airplane, you tend to wake people up. You wake up not only the people that you want to wake up to go to minyan, but you also wake up women, children, Jewish people, non-Jewish people. Some of the people have no interest in a minyan. You wake up babies. Is there something wrong with waking up a baby? Is there an avera in waking up a baby? Right? Your wife will tell you yes, but what about, is there an avera? Okay, so first of all, the question is there a concept of theft for stealing something intangible like sleep? Right? We know if I take your watch, it's theft. What if you're sleeping and I wake you up? Intangible. Is there such a thing as theft? So the Gemara in Baba Batra, he brings a Gemara in Baba Batra, talks about a number of people who live with a communal chutzner, a communal courtyard. And in the old days, they used to have a number of houses, like townhouses now, opening up into one big courtyard. The courtyard belonged to everybody together, and everybody's home opened up to that courtyard. So if you wanted to use that courtyard in a certain way, you could, because you were part owner, but you had to take into account other people's feelings too, because they were part owners. The Gemara says, if you want to open up in that communal courtyard a store and sell, other people in the courtyard can come and say, we forbid you from doing it. They can prevent him from doing it. Why? Because they can say, look, I can't sleep. I want to sleep. You wake me up. The noise of your store prevents me from sleeping at night, prevents me from taking a nap, wakes me up in the morning. People are coming and going. You're not allowed to do it. And the Gemara says that they can prevent him from setting up that store. So what does that tell you? So the BAYT Bechira, the Meiri, argues that the reason people can prevent you from setting up that store is because you're stealing their sleep. And he uses the term hezek shena, a damages based on removing other people's sleep. Right? People can stop, and I can paraphrase it. Any one person from the communal courtyard who wants to make a store, the neighbors, any one of them can prevent him, and they say we can't sleep because you're damaging my sleep. As well, he also brings a Shaila B'Tshuva responsum from Rav Menashe Klein. Anybody know who Rav Menashe Klein was? Ungvar, right? He was born in Ungvar in Slovakia in 1925. So he came to the United States, and he lived in the United States at the same time as Rav Moshe Feinstein. And he wrote before Rav Moshe Feinstein appeared on the scene. He was one of the people that they came to for response. So when Rav Moshe Feinstein came, he became a little more dominant. But his Shilas and Tshuvas are very interesting, and he takes some very interesting positions. And he says there is such a thing as Gezel Shena. There's such a thing as stealing people's sleep. What is the source for it? So he talks about another story in the Gemara where, this same Reb Nachman, he told his slave, if I fall asleep during, I think, the first parsha of Krishma, you can wake me up. But after that, don't wake me up. He says, there's a sign that he'd be stealing my sleep. Maybe for the first parsha of Krishma, it's very important. But after that, that was his source. But you see, there are definitely sources, especially like Gemara and Baba Batra, that you're not allowed to wreck somebody else's sleep. It's considered either damages or theft or so on. Okay, so that might be one prohibition against waking somebody up from sleep. Are there any other prohibitions against waking somebody up from sleep? So there are, he brings two other concepts. One, both based on mitzvah in the Sefer Chinuch. If you look in source 5, there is a mitzvah, v'ahavta l'reacha kamocha. You have to love your fellow Jew like yourself. And he says that the Sefer Chinuch gives reasons for the mitzvahs. They're not hard and fast rules, but what he thinks is the reason for the mitzvah. And he says the mitzvah, of course, to love your neighbor like yourself is to bring peace and harmony between people in the world. And he says if someone violates this mitzvah, and he's not careful about harming someone monetarily, and or he says, I put this in bold, Sara b'shum davar ladat. If he creates any anguish or pain for that person, and he knows he's doing it, he's violating the mitzvah v'ahavta l'reacha kamocha. Argues the
isn't there nezek involved as well?
In which way?
He's a laborer, and he works during the day, sleeps at night, you interrupt his sleep, and he's not going to be able to work as well in the day. You're causing a lot somewhere else.
Well, the Meiri, the Menashe Klein, that was the previous source. They believe that there is such a thing as hezek shena. Now you're taking it a step further, and you're saying, as a lawyer can take that to court and say, I can put a monetary value on that, and that because that monetary value prevented the person from working for a long time. I'll mention later. I'll mention it now. There are some commentators that say that stealing someone's sleep is worse than stealing his watch, because they don't put a monetary component. Unless you're not working. I don't work. I'm a retiree, right?
I learned.
Yeah, so you could go put a monetary number on learning, right?
Right.
He says, if I steal your watch, you can take me to court. I have to pay you back, or I can maybe I have regret. I pay you back. You steal someone's sleep. How do you pay them back? How do you make restitution?
How do you value it?
How do you value it? How do you make restitution? So you might find people who could value it, but maybe there can't be an agreement. But it's very, very hard to give restitution on anguish. Right, so we try to do that, but usually anybody who went to court and got, damages for emotional suffering will always tell you it didn't pay for what that person really suffered, right? So in some ways it's worse than all right. So there is a kind of theft, yes, okay. There's a kind of you're violating a mitzvah by causing other people anguish of loving your fellow Jew. And the Minchas Chinuch, who was I think Rav Yosef Babab, his name was, and he was a commentator on the Sefer Chinuch. The Sefer Chinuch was written in the 12th century, I believe, by authors unknown.
Our Haledi.
So there's a big I think it was somebody from Barcelona, and there's big arguments about who wrote it, and there's no conclusion about who really wrote it. I think it was one of the students of the Ramban, maybe. In any event, 700 years later, the Minchas Chinuch wrote a commentary on that. And in this particular issue, he says, you cannot separate your love of God from the love of your fellow Jews. In other words, I think what he's saying is, you can't say, I love God. My fellow Jews, I can take them or leave them. But God, I really love. The path to loving God, is the Minchas Chinuch is telling, is through loving Jews. In other words, you can come and say, I'm davening now. I'm davening. I'm talking to God. There are people around me, Jewish people, I couldn't care less, or I could care less, but not that much. But I'm so intensely involved with God in a passionate way that what's it really matter to me? The Minchas Chinuch is telling you that intrinsic to your love of God has to be your love of your fellow Jew. So if you're doing something to show your love for God, and at the same time you're ignoring your fellow Jew or causing anguish to your fellow Jew, don't think you're accomplishing what you're trying to accomplish, let's say by davening or davening by minyan. Okay, so that's why I brought them into Chinuch. Okay. Another mitzvah that he suggests, also from the Sefer Chinuch. There's a mitzvah not to oppress another Jew with speech. Lo lahanot echad Yisrael b'dvarim lo tonu. They talk about lo tonu. In other words, there's a mitzvah in the Torah not to oppress another person by stealing their money in some way, in other words, by dealing dishonestly with them. There's also an avera not to oppress another person with words, saying things that are nasty and so on. The Sefer HaChinuch seems to take it a step further, because he says from the Medina Mitzvah, from the part of the rules of this mitzvah, there are many warnings and encouragements that oblige us, that God obliges us, not not to cause pain to the creatures of the world. I mean, he means humans, in any way. Meaning, which he understands, is, I think, Rabbi Jason Weiner, to mean that it's not just what you say or how much money you take from the person, but even causing someone pain. Let's say waking someone up from sleep would come under the rubric of this prohibition. You're not allowed to oppress another Jew. The Minchas Chinuch, and I think he's just picking up on the Sefer HaChinuch, says that as far as he's concerned, this prohibition applies to children as well. Normally we say, children are not, they don't have full understanding, they don't have to do mitzvahs and so on and so forth. But as far as being victims, you're victimizing the child as much as you're victimizing an adult, because a child feels anguish, the adult feels anguish. You don't have to have full mature knowledge to suffer. In other words, so he said, you cannot press young children either. In other words, waking up babies is no less a cause of anguish, or no less an avera, than waking up adults. So I brought a number of reasons why you might want to think twice about what you're doing on an airplane when it comes to davening, right? You're trying to create a Kiddush Hashem, you have to make sure it's a Kiddush Hashem. If you're saying Kaddish, you want to make sure that people will have a higher regard for the deceased parent rather than a lower regard when you're saying Kaddish. There is a prohibition of stealing other people's sleep, according to many commentators. There's arguments about it. There is apparently at least two averot that you might be transgressing by waking people up from sleep. One is love of your fellow Jews, and not to oppress Jews with words. So how does one daven Shemona Esrei while seated on an airplane? So actually, the truth is, it was me yesterday. I saw it was a great first half. After that, the game was lousy. I think they only scored about 10 more points the whole game. But the first half was the greatest part. I always try to daven mincha when I take these 4 o'clock flights. I try to daven mincha in the airport or at home before I go. I forgot. I was watching this stupid football game. So I got into the plane. I said, what am I going to do now? So my wife said, well, didn't you give a share on that recently? So Rav Moshe Feinstein has a tshuva, what to do on an airplane when you want to daven Shemona Esrei. Because what's the problem? You're in this compact little area. You've got to get up in the aisles. It was a 3-hour flight. The stewardesses were always going back and forth. First they were giving out headsets, and then they were giving out the drinks, and then they were collecting the drinks, and then they were selling duty free, and it just goes on. And you can never walk through the aisle. And then there's people going to the washroom and going to visit their friends. So what do you do? Yes?
You just raised a point when I made a trip to Israel, and when asked by God, I'm going to touch on why I don't daven with me on a plane is just stand in the back. One, they're in the way of all the stewardesses in the galley, and two, they're davening in between 2 washrooms, and the toilet doors are opening and closing, while people are davening, which is also a bit of a problem. He
mentioned that. I wasn't going to bring that up, but very often where you're going to daven is going to be near one of the washrooms. Problem. Doors opening and closing for the washroom. Very good point. Very often where you're davening, there's no mechitza there. So apparently you don't need a mechitza if it's a davening that's not it's an arai thing. It's a temporary type of thing. But not everybody on the airplane is dressed in an appropriate way, and there are certain to say Kriyat Shema in the presence of individuals who are not dressed in an appropriate way is very much frowned upon. So there are those problems, and there's the problems, of course, of the stewardesses and whatever. So Rav Moshe Feinstein B'chvodo Ba'asmo comes to the conclusion that if you want to say, if you have to daven Shemona Esrei on the airplane, sit in your seat and daven Shemona Esrei. He says, he says more than that. If you do it sitting in your seat, so you'd think, it was like a half measure. I daven Mincha. When I get off the plane and I daven Marav, I'll say a second Shemona Esrei to make up for my Mincha Shemona Esrei. He says, nothing doing. You shouldn't do it. It's unnecessary. The Shemona Esrei that you daven in your seat on the airplane for Mincha is just as acceptable as if you were standing up, let's say, outside the airplane.
Even if you're facing the wrong way. Even if you're facing the wrong way.
The wrong way on a plane.
Right. So I think he means to. Yeah, I think that's the way it should be. I don't think that's ma'akev. I don't think Shemona Esrei is that if you can't possibly face the east, or if you don't know where the east side is, that you don't daven Shemona Esrei. I don't want to paskin on that, but I don't think it's an issue that we daven to the east. But if you have no choice, I think you should just daven and not worry about the east, right? And he says the person doesn't have to go back and say a second Shemona Esrei. And he says if it's hard for you to stand in your seat, and it'd be difficult for you, it's better to sit. And he says if you want to stand up, try to stand up just for the bowings. So what do you have to bow down 4 times? I think it's Shemona Esrei. So those 4 times you can try to get up from your seat and do enough you can do the bowings. Otherwise you can sit in your seat and that's fine. So that's the pretty authoritative source. So that's what I did, by the way. I davened Shemona Esrei in my seat. We were going north, so I guess I couldn't really look east. And I got up. I tried to get up to bow, and I didn't daven a second Shemona Esrei for Marav. Now, the question is, how permissible is it to wake a person up for minyan? Let's forget an airplane. Let's say I'm a student in a dormitory. Or let's say I'm on a business trip with another Jewish guy, and I'm in, Cleveland, and then there's a minyan around the corner, there's a shul, and I want to get up at 7 o'clock and go to the minyan. And he's sleeping. And he didn't tell me the night before, he may even be a religious Jew, he didn't tell me the night before that he wants to get up for minyan, and I wake up and I'm ready to go, and I see he's sleeping. I know it's an important mitzvah to daven in a minyan. Can I wake the guy up? It's a good thing, right? I wake him up. He wakes up, he says, I'm coming to minyan, and therefore he does a mitzvah. Let's say he wakes up and says, why do you have to wake me up? So I say to him, it's a mitzvah, so maybe you'll come. So my heart's in the right place, right? Is it permissible to wake that person up for the minyan? So in Shumat V'Hanhagot, which is a kind of a bit of a halacha response sefer that was written by Rav Moshe Sternbach. Anybody knows who Rav Moshe Sternbach is? Moshe Sternbach is the one of the heads of the Eidah Haredit in Israel. Now he was based at one point in South Africa, and he wrote a book called Shumat V'Hanhagot. Modim Alacha was Rav Zedin. Yeah.
He did something called Moed and something.
He may have written something similar. Yes, I'm sure he wrote something similar, but he wrote Shuvat on Hagot. So he says even if a person, let's say a Jewish person wants to sleep in the morning, miss davening, miss minyan, miss whatever he's and the person is not doing the right thing. And he mentions that the person is missing. I guess he assumes he'll daven, but he's missing davening with the minyan. He says you're not allowed to wake that person up unless he told you to. Unless he made it clear to you that he wants you to wake him up, it's prohibited for you to wake up that person for davening. And so I know certain people, I might even wake them up. I know I have a rabbi that I associate with. I know if he missed minyan, the lengths he goes to miss minyan, I suppose I might wake him up for minyan. I know he thanked me, by the way. But if you don't know that, you're not allowed to wake people up for a minyan. So you're in this airplane, and you're looking for 10 people. You're flying to Israel. Most people are trying to sleep a bit, and now the light comes through, and you need your 10 people. Well, you're going to go around asking people, do you want to daven for a minyan? You have to wake them up. You don't know that they want to daven for a minyan. He says that you should be, if the person tells you the night before, I want to daven by a minyan, that's another story. But if you don't know, as a Jewish guy, then you figure he might want me to wake him up, he says you shouldn't do that. It's interesting that Rav Pinchas Scheinberg, he quotes him. I don't have the source from him. And again, I wish I had the book here, so don't take me again as an authoritative source on this. But he mentions a very kind of strange thing that he says. He says when you're davening on an airplane, you are davening, that's tefillah b'tzibur. If you're davening alone on an airplane, you're in the same room as 9 other Jews, the room being the big airplane. He said that's equivalent to davening b'tzibur because you're davening with the crowd, right? Now, it's not clear to me that I don't think he means that you can say Kedusha and Baruch Hu and Krishma. But a person who feels that he wants to daven b'tzibur, he seemed to indicate that may be a way of doing so.
You only need, 6 answers, really, so you don't need all 10, so you could use.
It was very interesting. I didn't see the source inside. It was a very interesting stuff, but he was talking about in an airplane. I brought this up once. I gave this before this year, and somebody objected to that, and I don't have the sources for that.
You don't necessarily have a minyan in the base measures where everybody's davening, somebody's learning, doing something else.
So you have the same concept. There are 6 people and 4 others. Here you have 1 person and 9 others, and those 9 other people don't even know you're davening, right? So it's a little different, but it was an interesting thing. Anyhow, the reason this Rabbi Jason Weiner wrote this article in the first place was he said that he read in Halichot Shlomo, which was the last source here for Rav Shlomo, from Rav Shlomo Zalman Auerbach, Sefer Tzaddik L'Bracha. He read a piece. These are halachas that were written down by his students that they heard from him, in which Rav Shlomo Zalman Auerbach indicated that he was not happy about people making minyanim on airplanes. And I'll read it to you. So first they provide kind of halacha. If a person wants to daven in an airplane during the flight, he should daven Shemona Esrei sitting on his place, sitting in his seat, very much like what Rav Moshe Feinstein says, and not standing in the aisleway. Why? Because it interferes with other people. So you see, Rav Shlomo Zalman Auerbach, Rav Moshe's, these are people with very strong sensitivity for other people. And I understand what he's saying, I think. He's saying, again, this idea, what Kiddush Hashem is there for people to be wanting to go to the washroom and lined up for 5 minutes behind you because you're sitting there davening, you figure, I own the place. They're very sensitive to what other people thought. They weren't gedolim for nothing, right? They were gedolim in knowledge, they were gedolim in spirit, right? And then they have a little footnote that I read. It said, in any event, he was not lo hayta dat Rabbeinu Nocha. He was not pleased me'arichat minyanim for arranging a minyan for davening during a flight because it interferes with the other people there. So my argument is, by the way, anyhow, go ahead. You can comment on it.
I was going to ask you. So, how did you feel about making a minyan in the airport lounge beforehand, and there's all other going watching and seeing what's going on there?
So me personally, even after doing this, I don't see the problem. As long as you're not on top of other people, I've been in airport lounges many times where I could daven in a corner and away from everybody, and it wasn't bothering anybody. Didn't interfere with anybody. There's lots of room there. People may look at me and say, well, what's he doing? That's kind of interesting. I don't see why that should stop me from davening. I'm not doing anything negative. I'm not hurting the other person. So sometimes if I have an early flight and I can't daven, I'll take my Tallis and Tefillin with me and I'll daven in the lounge, but I don't do it in a way that bothers anybody else. And I try to go in the corner. I'm not trying to make a spectacle of myself. I think the same thing goes with the minyan. If you're far enough away from the crowd, if you're not making a spectacle of yourself, why should that bother somebody?
If you're on an airplane and a minyan is forming, if you understand the position of Rav Shlomo Zalman Auerbach, who discourages forming a minyan, you see a minyan is forming, and you know how the staff gets hits on the aircraft. Should you participate, or should you continue to daven be at peace?
So I remember when I was discussing this, somebody told me a story from.
But you have to be advised not to make the minyan.
Right. So somebody told me a story about, now this is again the story secondhand, that he was once on an airplane with Rav Shlomo Miller, who is a very authoritative rabbi of, say, in this city, who, and he wanted to make a minyan. And he asked people to come for a minyan, he asked Rav Miller to come for a minyan too, and he said he went a little bit reluctantly. I'm sure he knew all this and more. He said, so they made their little minyan, they were making their minyan, and a stewardess came by, and she was trying to get through, and she said, you're disturbing. He said, okay, everybody, we're leaving now. And he just broke up the minyan, and everybody went back to their seat. So, it seems that if you have the feeling that it is going to interfere, that you are probably, maybe even wise not to participate and to discourage.
Because it was just mentioned previously, you said the minyan's always in the galley. It's always interrupting the staff. It's always beside the washroom. You have to.
You know, the problem is that a lot of these minyanim are based on people who are saying Kaddish. It's an extremely emotional issue. I remember, well, anyway, I said Kaddish for a year. Felt very, very driven to say Kaddish, right? Missing a Kaddish, I mean, it's irrational, but you feel that you're missing something. Even though, by the way, halakhically, it's not clear that you have to say Kaddish 8 times a day.
What about Talis and Tillum? What about Talis and Tillum?
So why would that interfere with anybody? The only question is...
On an airplane, it does.
Oh.
You have somebody sitting beside you that is not related to you.
Yeah, I understand. I understand that might be a problem. So Talis and Tillum for me isn't the biggest problem in the world from my perspective, because I think you can fulfill the mitzvah of Talis and Tillum any time during the day.
Right.
Problem is we like to say Krishma with our Talis and Tillum on, because it's, you know, in Krishma we say you put on your tefillin.
So there are people that, I don't know if there's an authoritative source for this, but they will daven the entire davening without Talis and Tillum.
And
they will then put on the Talis and Tillum, make a bracha for 2 seconds, take it off, and sit down again.
So, okay, I can accept that, or wait till they get off the plane.
Right.
Right.
Even if it's after his lunch break.
Now, the airplanes I go on mostly, I'm not going on the first class high powered airplanes. Mostly there's not much space on them. And even in first class section there's not much space. But if you have a situation where you have to daven mincha and it takes 5 minutes and everybody's finished serving and it's a long flight and the attendants are sitting in their chairs talking to each other and there's nobody in the kitchen, there's nobody nowhere, and if there happens to be in that area a place where there's some space, and if there doesn't have to be anybody sleeping there, it's a daven mincha for 5 minutes to make someone happy to say Kaddish, I think that's not the worst thing in the world. But it would have to be, I think, special circumstances. To say that I'm going to say Kaddish because it's important for me to say Kaddish, or it's important for me to have a minyan, and I don't care who I'm interfering with or what kind of spectacle I'm making myself in terms of making other people uncomfortable, I think that's what this Rabbi Weiner was trying to say, is what motivated people like Rav Moshe Feinstein and Rav Shlomo Zalman Auerbach, Zichronim Livracha, to come up with this concept of sitting in your seat and davening. Make sense?
Otherwise, it's a chilul Hashem. I mean, at the end of the day, it's...
The purpose of davening, according to Shulchan Aruch Harav, is to be Mekadesh Shem Shemayim B'Rabbi. Are you doing that? No? So, what time is it? Is it late? What time?
15:20.
I think, by the way, does somebody want to add or subtract? I'm happy.
Go ahead. Thank you.